Hello, this is David Rovix with another episode of Discussions with David, a live stream broadcast I've been doing every Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday during the pandemic, as long as I can't travel and play music for a living anymore. I'm also broadcasting on Mondays and Tuesdays. Mondays, I host Pandemic Open Mic Mondays, which anyone with a song, poem, or rant is encouraged to sign up for at davidrovix.com/POMM. Tuesdays, I host Fifth Estate Live, produced by Peter Werby. All of these live stream broadcasts start at 10 a.m. Pacific, noon Central, 1 p.m. Eastern, 6 p.m. GMT every weekday. And you can find them both live and in archived form on the Facebook pages of Popular Resistance, KBOO Community Radio, and my own Facebook pages and channels on YouTube, Periscope, Twitch, VK, and LinkedIn. If you go to davidrovix.com or search on any podcasting platform for the podcast This Week with David Rovix, you can also find these programs in audio form soon after they are broadcast live. Another place you can find the broadcasts, along with lots of free content, as well as content reserved only for patrons, such as my 16-part audio memoir, is at patreon.com/davidrovix. That's also where you can support my various musical and non-musical efforts at Popular Education. Today, I'm very happy to have on the show a man who is the author of several of the best books I've ever read. Jeremy Brecher has been involved with movement organizing and popular education since the early 1960s. He's produced dozens of documentaries for Connecticut Public Television, and he's written many groundbreaking books, including the labor history Strike, the Global Justice Movement Organizing Handbooks Globalization from Below and Global Village or Global Pillage, books about local history, and books about telling the story of your community, and many, many essays for a wide variety of publications. Jeremy Brecher, it's a pleasure to have you with me.
It's great to see you, David.
Yeah, great to see you. And I thought we could start with, can you just, I know you live in a small town in northwestern Connecticut, with which I have great familiarity, having grown up there, at least in the summers. And I wonder if you can just start out by talking about what's it been like over the past few weeks and months there in northwestern Connecticut.
The most fascinating thing is in the period of the uprising and Black Lives Matter wave 2 of the last few weeks. I was just driving through Sharon, Connecticut, which is another town similar to Cornwall, population of maybe a couple thousand, some old New England Yankees of various kinds, and a variety of city people who have bought houses and land up there. And those are the big population groups. And coming over this little mountain road to suddenly see hand-painted Black Lives Matter signs in front of houses on the roadside, you would expect, gee, these people must be risking the wrath of their neighbors who will come out and smite them, or at least tear down their signs. And instead, we have amazingly what appears to be a wave of sympathy for Black Lives Matter, a desire to be associated with the uprising, with the action and support of anti-racist feelings and behavior. And the small towns around here have been having regular Black Lives Matter demonstrations. I just saw one at the high school I went to, Housatonic Valley Regional High School. The kids from Canaan, Connecticut, another little town here, were upset that all the other towns had Black Lives Matter demonstrations and Canaan hadn't, so they organized a Black Lives Matter demonstration in Canaan with, I don't know, maybe 80 people showing up for it.
Which is like half of Canaan's population, right? It's like, and these towns are almost entirely probably about 98% white or something.
Yeah. Indeed. And they are our little town of Cornwall, you'll be proud to know, is now having a weekly Sunday demonstration at the Triangle and Cornwall Bridge, the little green there, Black Lives Matter support demonstration. So this is a historical phenomenon. If it was just happening here, I'd say it was a weird freak. But when you read the accounts of what's happening around the country, it's clear that there's a virus that's gotten out. Besides coronavirus, there's another one. Maybe it's the anti-racism virus, and it seems to be catching on in very, very strange ways and places. So that is the most striking thing that I've been seeing here.
Do you, I mean, in Cornwall and Canaan and these little towns in Connecticut, do you recall anything else like this in the past? Like, I mean, in 2003, was there a weekly vigil against the war in Iraq the way there was in many other towns?
Oh yes, there was, and we had our own. We called it the Iraq moratorium. We had a little committee. We held meetings in the town. There's always been a liberal contingent in this town. And they turned out in force. And there also was a good turnout for a number of months for the early anti-Trump it wasn't called Banded Together. What was the name of the Indivisible? There was a number of months where there were regular meetings and actions by Indivisible in the early months of the Trump regime. And there were strong it's an area that has a strong peace sentiment in a substantial part of the population. So there were, before that, turnouts for certainly anti-Vietnam War activities and anti-Iraq War activities. But this is very special. In a way, this is, and I should say that going back to the civil rights movement of the 60s, there was a local civil rights group called Concern. There were people who marched across the state of Connecticut in civil rights protests, and a fair number of people who went south for some of the big demonstrations and marches. So it's not an area that's never had this kind of thing before, but especially coming out of really 40 years of conservative dominance and the quite wildly extreme almost 4 years of the Trump reign, to suddenly see this break out and to break out among such a diversity of people is quite extraordinary.
It really is, and it's a whole confluence of things happening at the same time, which is very difficult to unpack. But it's also, like, I guess, historically, in terms of other major social movements, that's not unusual either. I mean, it's usually not just one thing happening, right?
Well, Lenin, not someone I always agree with, but someone that I often find has some pithy remarks to quote, said, "A chain will break at its weakest link." And for whatever reason, people have been pulling at this chain and pulling at this chain and pulling at this chain, and it didn't break. But when it broke, the link broke, and then the chain broke. And to change the metaphor, all of the chickens came home to roost that had been flying around, wondering when the heck they were going to be able to come down and land. And
I know, right? I've been wondering about all those chickens, and I keep on thinking of chickens too. You know, Malcolm X and chickens is just on my mind every day when I wake up.
So, but they seem to be landing and roosting in an amazingly constructive fashion,
Right.
getting rid of the evil forces, and at the same time, very, at least for now, strong feeling of the need of people to pull together in the face of all the terrible problems and crises we're facing.
Any statues coming down around there?
Not that I'm aware of. But we have had over the last few years in Connecticut quite a lively discussion. The fact that Connecticut had slavery and quite a lot of slavery was kind of rediscovered in the last decade or so. And there has been a lot of discussion about the facts, long forgotten facts, except the few people who've been trying to remind the state about it for a long time. But there's a kind of been a rediscovery of the extent of slavery. The fact that the leading slaveholders were usually the congregational ministers, who were the leading men in each town, something that would be very shocking to people in Connecticut, and especially Congregationalists now. Although
because they were also involved with abolitionism later.
Right? A major part of abolitionism, played a role in the Underground Railroad. The people who supported the Amistad Revolt, the captives, African captives who came, were being brought to Cuba and seized their ship and ended up in Connecticut and won a famous law case. And went back, sailed back to Africa. The main supporters of the Amistad captives were Congregationalists, so it was definitely a divided denomination and a divided community.
But can you talk a bit about what about slavery in Connecticut? That seems like a very, I mean, it's a great subject to discuss for a few minutes here, because I mean, so much of the debate is around the Confederacy, and you know, as if the South was the only place that such things happened.
It was virtually from the very beginning of the state. It had enslaved Africans. Some of the earliest ones, the colonists, when they came into Connecticut, conducted a massacre, probably intended to be a genocide. They killed all the women and children of the Pequot tribe. Unfortunately for them, the Pequots really knew the area and the swamps much better than the British colonists did, and so they pulled back into the hinterland and were able to hide. But the colonists captured a bunch of them and enslaved them, but they had the problem that they couldn't keep them enslaved because they would keep disappearing back into the hinterland and the swamps. So finally, they took boatloads of captive Pequots and shipped them to the Caribbean and traded them for African captives, African slaves, who they brought to Connecticut and enslaved there. And they were some of the first slaves, first African slaves in Connecticut. And then there were many more. It was very active, being a great trading colony. There was great activity in the slave trade by Connecticut ship owners and captains. So there's a very big role. And there were most of the slavery in Connecticut was congregational ministers and other wealthy leaders. But there were a few plantations with quite a sizable numbers, at least dozens or scores of slaves doing production agriculture, not just being a household or farm helper. So there's a very strong legacy. And the last Connecticut slave didn't die until, I believe, the 1840s, died in slavery in the 1840s.
Wow.
They had what they called gradual abolition, as befits the land of steady habits. and that's how gradual it was. So I think your basic point, slavery was a something that whatever guilt attaches to slavery and whatever shame attaches to slavery, it's not just people in the South, and it's not just the slaves, what were the recognized slave states, but it was the really foundation, part of the foundation of the entire American nation.
Some different religious groups that owned human beings were, when the church decided it was no longer acceptable, that's when some slave owners phased out their ownership of slaves. I've read a bit about that in relation to my own relatives.
Well, there was definitely conflict within many of the churches about slavery. As a matter of fact, there were many Quaker slave owners in the early days, and there was a campaign within the Quaker denomination to persuade the slave owners to free their slaves. And then there was pushback and anger and counterattack against the abolitionists within the Society of Friends, and they eventually created an atmosphere in which, in order to be a Quaker in good standing, you had to not be a slaveholder. And then, of course, the Quakers became leader figures, in particular in the Underground Railroad, as well as more broadly in the abolitionist movement. But the same thing happened with the Congregationalists, who were the predominant. They really were the dominant force in Connecticut, and they were originally, as I say, many of the ministers were slave owners, but they moved, and many congregations were split. I believe that the Cornwall Congregationalist congregation was split on slavery, anti-slavery. Certainly a number of the congregations around here were deeply divided, and people were expelled when one side got control, and then or excommunicated, and people on the other side would take control, and then the other side would get pushed out. So it was a very, very live struggle in these parts.
And then, as so much of the discussion around the legacy of slavery and racism, and then fast forward to the modern period and Connecticut, I mean, like the rest of the country, but it's having grown up there, it seems like Connecticut is maybe especially stratified in terms of the wealth gap and the gap between many wealthy. Of course, there's also lots of poor white people in Connecticut as well. But there's quite a wealthy white population, and the cities seem to be largely full of extreme poverty in places like Bridgeport and New Haven. So
Bridgeport and New Haven are normally listed and Hartford are normally listed as 2 or 3 of the poorest cities in the country, in spite of it. And Connecticut, for a very long time, was listed as the wealthiest or second wealthiest state in the country. So that gives some idea of the gap that you're talking about. And it's all the racial segregation in Connecticut, although legal racial segregation has been outlawed for quite a long time. But the de facto segregation is huge, and it's largely associated with the town system, in which we don't have functional counties, we don't have regional or metropolitan governments. Each town is like a little kingdom or principality unto itself. And so the city, so all the suburbs of any major city are highly segregated. What used to be called the white noose that surrounded American cities was much whiter in Connecticut than almost any other place. And the school systems are based on the towns. So the inner cities, like Hartford or New Haven or Bridgeport or Waterbury, were overwhelmingly minority, African American and other minorities, and surrounded by extremely white suburbs. And all of this not by legal segregation per se, but by the fact that the kids couldn't go to school. Kids from, say, Hartford couldn't go to school in, say, Glastonbury or any of the outlying towns. And so you had complete school segregation without any legal basis for it, except the legal basis of how the school systems were set up. And that remains the case today, in spite of there being court cases for decades that have challenged it and required changes, but they have not, in fact, happened on a significant scale.
Because it really comes to this point of actual action, not deeds. Like there was the minister in Seattle of the AME church there said, if Black Lives matter, then the cost of housing in the Central District matters, which is historically a mostly Black neighborhood, certainly not now in Seattle. But then to address that kind of question, then we get to the real sort of the housing market and the value of neighborhoods and all this kind of stuff, which seems to have been, I mean, it's like one thing to say Black Lives Matter, and then it's another thing to actually, turn Connecticut into something other than an apartheid state or this whole country. And I wonder just what thoughts you have on that, because this is such a long historical struggle there.
I've been writing very recently. I've discovered a couple of wonderful documents from the movement for Black Lives. And I recommend anyone who's interested in the question that you just raised, take a look. And they are programs for looking at the what are the things that are necessary beyond controlling out of control police to make Black lives secure, make Black lives genuinely matter. And they're great documents. I just wrote a couple of commentaries about them on my web commentary, which is Jeremy Brecher's Corner, also called Strike. And
where can people find that? Because I was just looking at jeremybrecher.org, which has a lot of great resources on it, but this is somewhere else you're talking about?
Right. I'm doing a regular series of commentaries, usually weekly. They're called Commentaries on Solidarity and Survival. And the easiest way to get to them is just to go to the website of the Labor Network for Sustainability, which is labor4sustainability.org. It comes right up, a button for it.
Great.
And, in this case, as I was watching the events of the last month or so, I thought, what can I do that's useful? And I thought, holding up what are some of the most powerful statements about what we need, not only in terms of controlling the police, but what we need in these broader social areas that you were pointing to, like housing. What are some of the most powerful and useful concrete proposals from the Black Lives Matter movement? So I've been writing about those and holding them up. And one of the things that's most striking is how much they converge with the Green New Deal. and the programs of the Green New Deal. In fact, the Black Movement for Black Lives programs specifically incorporate the Green New Deal as part of what's necessary for addressing the issues of Black lives. And at the same time, these proposals, these documents, help enrich the Green New Deal. They help spell out some of the things that the Green New Deal is going to need to do in order to address the specific problems of African Americans. So that's how I've tried to contribute my widow's mite, my little tiny weight to the uprising.
Yeah, good. Yeah, and this whole concept of defunding the police, like, I mean, it's just a wonderful radical idea, and it's obviously terrifying to many people in power. But it's the whole question of unpacking that and what would that really mean in terms of the impact on society, and because it seems like, I mean, the role of the police, it's being talked about a lot on the corporate media, and it feels to me somewhat divisive the way that they're talking about it, and probably intentionally, that that now they're talking about the role of the police as a slave patrol, which is such an important aspect of the history of the police in this country, right? But it's I hear so little mention of the other very important aspect of the police forces in so many countries, which goes hand in hand with the Industrial Revolution, to defend the property of the rich and control the labor movement. I wonder any thoughts you have on the media narrative that's going on here around the police. Well, you have an actual landline. That's so exciting. I think for many of our listeners, it might be the first time they've heard a landline ringing. You know, we do have quite a few teenagers and folks in their 20s who are watching this. And
yeah, and I'm sorry. I apologize for it.
No problem.
As you mentioned, I've written quite a bit about American labor history, and there really is a story that has rarely been told about the use of violence to suppress American workers. It has been ubiquitous from the earliest days of strikes and labor organizing in the United States. And it actually has continued into the 21st century in a variety of ways. So the use of the police, also of National Guard, and also at times of the U.S. Military has been something that's happened thousands of times with the police, hundreds of times with the National Guard and the military. And this has been historically a major function of the police. Most urban police forces had red squads, as they called them, which were anti-radical, but included in the idea of what was a radical threat was the strikes and worker organizing. And so that is another critical piece of the legacy of police, and why we have police who is not just the friendly policeman in your neighborhood who helps little children across the street. And I think the other thing here is there's two aspects, and I really wasn't completely aware of the more recent developments of this until the uprising and the things that it's brought to light. there's a long-term history of the involvement of the police with repressing both Black communities and labor. But there is what's often referred to as militarization of the police in the last couple of decades that is at a disproportionate scale, in which large parts of the police have been turned into basically military operations with military type armor and training and practices that they use that are very much like what an army does in an occupied country. And I think before in Black communities, it was often said, and it was true, that the police operated like an army in an occupied country. But this has become much, much more true and deliberate in the last few years. So I think another piece of the if you're unpacking defund the police, another piece of it is defund the militarization of the police. That's not to be an advocacy for other roles of the police, which also need to be, we need to have a different way to make our streets and our communities safe. But a crucial first step would be to get rid of the parts that are like an occupying army, people just have to keep holding that up and exposing the realities of it. Interestingly, just before the shooting of Floyd, there was a gathering of Black Lives, a movement for Black, sponsored by Movement for Black Lives Matter and other community groups in Los Angeles that proposed a plan for defunding the police and where you would spend the money on community food programs and social workers and all the other things, mental health, community mental health facilities, all the other things that would make the police not be the force that dealt with any human problem that happened to occur in public or even in someone's apartment, and would have other ways of dealing with it and would fund those by reducing the funds to the police. And then all of a sudden, there was the Floyd's murder and Black Lives Matter revival, and all of a sudden, the mayor of Los Angeles said, "Oh, we're gonna do it. We're gonna partially defund the police and do this plan that had seemed like a totally utopian, totally out of reach kind of proposal a few weeks before." So I found that a very interesting case of, you might say, the spirit made flesh.
Yeah. How these ideas that seemed so utopian a few weeks ago suddenly are like universal basic income. I mean, who thought that the Trump administration would be the one to bring that in for at least a few months?
Right.
So we are talking with Jeremy Brecher on Discussions with David, which you can hear live at 10 a.m. Pacific, noon Central, 1 p.m. Eastern, 6 p.m. GMT, Wednesday through Friday every week, along with other broadcasts I host at the same time on Mondays and Tuesdays. All of these broadcasts go out live on the Facebook pages of Popular Resistance, KBOO Community Radio, and elsewhere, and they're all archived on my YouTube channel at youtube.com/drovix, on Patreon at patreon.com/davidrovix, and in podcast form if you look for This Week with David Rovix on any podcasting platform. I wonder about as this movement grows and develops, we can be, of course, absolutely certain that the powers that be will be, and the corporate media that serve them will be trying everything they can to divide the movement and figure out fault lines and ways to divide and conquer the movement. I mean, maybe I'm just being pessimistic, but assuming that that's the case, I wonder what thoughts you have on the ways that they're going to try to divide the movement and how that can be resisted.
Well, the most obvious thing that they've tried to do is to treat the movement or say, well, it's been infiltrated by Antifa, by criminals, a criminal element, revolutionaries, et cetera, it's kind of comical because the most obvious infiltration seems to have been by militarized right-wing nuts who have seen this as an opportunity to fire off their guns. And interestingly, the population, even the white population, when they do polling, basically says, well, this is basically a peaceful movement. And even though they don't support the looting and firing and stuff like that, they actually have not, by and large, I mean, the extent of people, including of white people, who say they support the movement and they don't believe they don't support the way it's been repressed and also abused, has happened in spite that. In other words, that tactic is not working very well at the moment. Now, you could easily see if some either misguided movement participants or more likely agents provocateurs managed to pull off some big seemingly terrorist-like action. The opportunity for Fox News and even mainstream news and politicians to define it as, oh, we see this movement really isn't for civil rights and human rights and decency and all the reasons you supported it. This is to kill a revolutionary movement, to kill white people or whatever. One can easily imagine opportunities arising that they could use to exploit that. The strongest tool the movement has to fight that is project what it's done so far brilliantly, which is to project an understanding to the public of what it really is about, both by showing the evils that it's opposing and by showing that the forms of action it's using are powerful and strong, but they're not a threat. They're a threat to people who want to preserve racism because they're going to get rid of, they're going to reduce racism, but they're not a threat to Ma and Pa America, who don't have to worry that some evil agent of some evil country is going to come and brutalize their sons and daughters. And I think if we can keep projecting the way in which we're what offers hope of a decent future, I think that's the most powerful way to head off the attempts to marginalize the movement and divide it. Obviously, there's more to be said about this, but we've made a good start on that, and let's hold on to it.
Yeah, and there's also limits to the amount that can be said in an hour-long interview. But I'd really encourage people to read many of your books, which actually talk a lot more about strategies for movement building and globalization from below and global village or global pillage. I think are, I don't know. I mean, I haven't read them in a while, but I don't think they're particularly dated, although they're talking about a certain period. But
let me also say that I just published a new edition of Strike. You can believe it. It's the 50th anniversary edition, and it has a very big section covering what I call the mini revolts of the 21st century, from the Battle of Seattle against the World Trade Organization, and on through the huge immigrant marches of
2006.
Right. And then on through the Women's March and the student strikes for climate and the Puerto Rican uprising that ousted the governor of Puerto Rico. So it's got many of the most significant, and also the first wave of Black Lives Matter. So it's got many of the most significant popular movements and uprisings for the last 20 years covered in similarities and differences from the movements that it looks at for the last now almost 200 years.
Yeah, fantastic. I hear a lot of media people talking about the 60s because it seems to be the last movement that they are aware of, or that, they grew up knowing that it existed, but they don't seem to have necessarily noticed anything that happened since then. And when they talk about things that are unprecedented or haven't happened since the 60s, sometimes it's really obvious that they just haven't done any research because, like, I heard people talking about in Houston how this is the biggest demonstration in Houston since the 60s, which it clearly is not. I was there in 2006. There were 50,000 people in 2006 in Houston on a Monday protesting against the federal government's plans to further criminalize the immigrant population. And I don't know if you have just any thoughts on the importance of not having amnesia.
Well, I think programs like this and the various forms of alternative media are absolutely critical. Not sufficient. We have to change the rest of the media too, but to have a vehicle that non-fake news and especially voices of people. Where different groups and different kinds of people can hear each other, so to speak, around the din of the central media is absolutely crucial, and has, for example, I did it, as I say, a history of the first wave of Black Lives Matter, and it was fascinating the way in which people using social media, people on the street actually engaged directly in all kinds of protests and demonstrations and confrontations with the police, and at the same time they were holding their cell phones and their social media devices in their hands and broadcasting on social media. There used to be a big argument about social media versus in the streets and real action, and that division has been totally obliterated as far as I can see.
Yeah, now it's all of the above.
They completely merged. The first time I ever saw this was in Occupy Wall Street.
Yeah. That was really, I think in Zuccotti Park, and the first day when I was there in Occupy Wall Street was it September 17th, there were, it literally just, I think everybody who wasn't holding a guitar was holding some kind of a camera,
And when I arrived, not quite so early, that's exactly what I saw. And it was like, oh, okay, this question has been answered.
Yeah.
Oh, anyway, I think that's all crucial. And the way in which, and has allowed people to communicate with each other outside and around the controlled media, and get around the gatekeepers, is absolutely crucial, and is crucial to the movements that we have had, which are extremely powerful. I wouldn't, as a historian, it's true that people could self-organize before there was social media and did so, and I could give 100 examples, but it makes it a heck of a lot easier.
So, but on that though, I mean, in general, perhaps it makes it easier. But I don't know how much you've done sort of research into the algorithms on Facebook and YouTube, and how much they affect what we see, and sort of creating echo chambers and arguments where there might not need to be any arguments. And I mean, it's sort of their algorithms are fueled by conflict and disinformation, as opposed to more sort of practical, I don't know, platforms like Twitter, which is basically just a chronological feed of whatever people post. So it seems much more useful, but of course Facebook is what's used much more than Twitter.
Yeah.
Although notably in the Black community, Twitter is more popular.
Well, to answer your question, this is not something that I've looked into in a serious way. I know that programs like this are able to circumvent those kinds of controls, and that's really what I was trying to say, is that that's a crucial thing, because we can hear each other through that. I think the capture or co-optation of channels for people to communicate with each other that appeared to be, or once were, more in a network and less top-down form, is a very serious, severe problem, and it makes those media to be potentially controlled vehicles for the powerful to talk to the rest of us, rather than for us to talk to each other, in a way that's a serious problem, as you point out. But the means for, I mean, basically in the long run, you can't have a democratic society where 99% of the communication is controlled by the 1%. Mm-hmm. And so democratizing the whole communication system has to be part of a program for democratizing American society. And that's going to involve a lot of things: broadcast media, captive social media, et cetera, et cetera. Mm-hmm. So I think the answer is yes, it's going to have to be, that's going to have to be transformed. But I think guerrilla communications is going to be essential in the meantime.
Right. I've been talking to, quite a few people who are, old enough to have been very actively involved with the 60s and movements since the 60s. And for obvious reasons, I have not talked with anybody who has a lot of firsthand knowledge of movements prior to the 60s, especially like going back to the 30s or whatever. I mean, growing up, of course, when I was young, and the people who are young in the 30s, who are young adults in the 30s, were very much the backbone of the left, I would say, when I was young in the 80s, in 90s as well. But I mean, people like, I'm thinking of, our neighbor there, Bob Steck, and so many other people of that generation, the Lincoln Brigaders and stuff. But it seems like, as a history buff myself, and as an actual historian yourself, there are so many examples in history that are maybe more relevant than anything in living memory to try to make sense of the current historical moment. And I don't know how much you've been thinking about 1918 and 1846, but I just think that they both have a lot of they might both have a lot to instructive elements for the current period. And I just wonder, like, going back to well before your own living memory, if as a historian there are particular moments that that seem especially relevant.
Well, actually, at the moment in my commentaries that I mentioned before, the one I'm just about to put out is about grassroots movements in the early 1930s, in the early years of the Great Depression, since we were clearly going into a level of economic catastrophe with the coronavirus depression that isn't comparable to anything except the Great Depression. And so, how did ordinary folks react to that? What did they do when you had an even more extreme version of government not taking responsibility, having neglect for desperate needs of tens and millions of unemployed people and destitute people? So I'm actually right now looking at the comparison between that time and today, and looking at the grassroots movements.
Yeah.
And first of all, and then I'm doing a series in which I'm comparing those to what's happened so far in the coronavirus era. So first
Great.
of all, looking at movements of the unemployed, which were very significant and kind of spark plugs for everything else that happened in the early years of the Depression before the New Deal. And I've been very struck by the fact we have now at a minimum 45 million people, and it's probably millions more than that, who have lost their jobs. They got some money to tide them over, some bridge money for a month or so, and that is right on the edge of running out. And nobody seems to have a handle on how these people are going to survive. And also, no one seems to be talking about what they need to do or can do to create conditions that will make it possible for them to survive. And let me just give a micro and a macro example. The micro example is the fact that there's a burgeoning set of mutual aid and self-help efforts going on, again, making great use of social media and communications. There are networks that have developed all over the place designed to allow people to barter, trade services and stuff like that as a way of getting by, which was a major force in the early days of the Great Depression. But there also are networks of people who have started from the people who had enormous difficulty getting their unemployment and their federal checks, and they created little sort of online associations to help each other out, and even use them as a base for doing motorcades to state capitals, demanding that the programs, unemployment and other programs that are supposed to help people function the way they were supposed to. Well, we're about to hit a situation where 40 or 50 million people are going to be dumped and not have any more money. There's about to be the rent moratoriums in many states are just coming to an end. It's going to be a tremendous human crisis for tens and tens of millions of people. And at the same time, there is a so-called stimulus package. It's called passed the House under the title of the HEROES Act. And it's totally bottled up in the Senate and seems like it has a very good chance of being blocked completely, which has a reasonably decent short-term proposal, funding for the next stage that would at least allow that 40 or 50 million people to survive. I haven't heard anybody calling for them to be in the streets demanding the passage of the HEROES Act. And I do not understand why. I don't know where the left is. I don't know where the unions are. And I don't know where the other groups, for example, there's money for the post office and for public sector workers. Why aren't they mobilizing the unemployed to see that the stimulus funding at least continues for a few more months, as well as trying to help them organize to make a longer range proposal. So I think that's something that anyone who's in especially anyone who's unemployed themselves or lost their jobs, is perfectly easy to connect with the networks that are already there and find more people who are in this situation, and ask your senators. And I'm not always an advocate of lobbying, but when it's 40 or 50 million people who are facing complete destitution, I think lobbying could be pretty effective.
I think here in Oregon, there's more lobbying going on than I think ever. I mean, in terms of the Portland Tenants United organization, they have been very actively doing a lot of lobbying. And there's some organization forming, calling itself the Union, what is it, the Unemployed Workers Council. And it seems to be largely anarchist youth who are organizing it, as far as I can tell, just judging from the posters. But it's can you talk about the Union of the Unemployed in the 30s and what kinds of tactics they engaged in?
Sure. They were called unemployed councils. I think people have borrowed the name, which is good. And they were extremely fluid. They usually had, well, they didn't have dues, or if they did, it was pennies. They were whoever showed up, basically. Their biggest, they had a few substantial marches, 2 or 3 substantial national marches. They had, and some of those were, for example, the veterans marched, so-called bonus army, which came on railroad, hoboed across the country to come to Washington and have an encampment. The anti-eviction actions were some of the most effective. They would, if someone got evicted and the sheriff came and put their furniture out in front of the house, 100 or 200 neighbors would gather together at the call of an unemployed council and surround the house and move the furniture back in. And this was powerful enough that in a number of cities, including Chicago, finally the government gave up and said, we're just not going to have any more evictions. And they also advocated and lobbied for unemployment compensation. There was no such thing at that time. And they also occupied state capitals and other state buildings and sometimes city buildings, but it was most strongest in state capitals, demanding various forms of unemployed relief, cash relief, what we today would call welfare, but also public works programs. And although there was tremendous resistance to it when they started putting tens of thousands of unemployed workers occupying state capitals, there was some pretty rapid change on the part of state level policy. And that, and maybe we can wrap with this, ended up being a major force that eventually led to the New Deal, and led the New Deal to finally say the well-being of the American working people is a responsibility of the federal government, and we have to have jobs programs. We have to have income maintenance and support programs. We have to have health programs, because that's what we have to do or as one mayor said, send money today or send the military tomorrow.
Excellent way to put it. Yeah. Jeremy, thanks so much for joining my show. And tell us where, once again, where people can find your weekly commentaries. I'm going to post that.
I would go to Labor Network for Sustainability is the organization. The website is labor4 sustainability.org. And you'll find a big yellow patch that says strike, and that has the website as well as where to get my book.
Oh, great. Thanks so much, Jeremy. I'll talk to you again soon. I hope have you back. There will be a lot more to talk about in a few weeks if you're available.
That would be great. Thank you.
Thank you.
Take care.
Take care. And thank you, everybody, for tuning into this conversation with Jeremy Brecher. You can find this and other discussions with David in archived form in various locations, such as the Discussions with David playlist on youtube.com/drovix, at patreon.com/davidrovix, at soundcloud.com/davidrovix, and on any podcasting platform if you search for the podcast This Week with David Rovix. I have a new album out on Bandcamp, which you can stream for free, called Notes from a Failed State. The music, the live stream broadcasts, and the podcasts are all free. But if you want to support my journalistic and musical efforts, plus have access to some exclusive offerings just for patrons, please join my community-supported art program, or CSA, at davidrovix.com/subscribe or patreon.com/davidrovix. Artists for Rent Control is now set up to start organizing an emergency eviction response team. Please go to artistsforrentcontrol.org and sign up. My next planned broadcast will be the 10th weekly Pandemic Open Mic Monday. Sign up to participate at davidrovix.com/POMM. Hope to see you again soon here in the Matrix and out on the streets. Don't pay the rent and don't be afraid of your neighbors. Mutual aid will get us through. Bye for now.